Immediately after the inauguration in 2025, a very different presidency would emerge. A slew of executive orders would fly off the desk of the Oval Office, making changes to nearly every aspect of the administrative state. President Donald Trump's opponents could not keep up with them. Very shortly into his second term, Donald Trump would address the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum had for decades been a frivolous back-patting session of elites, would-be elites, and self-important academics who believed that they knew what was best for the world. Now, on a large screen before them, Donald Trump would make a declaration that they no longer ran the world, that their order was done, that oil would flow, and that tariffs were coming. During the meeting, he would speak directly to Bank of America Chairman and CEO, Brian Moynihan, telling him that the debanking of political opponents would stop. He spoke with clear authority, the authority of force. And so, as the White House was churning out executive orders, it became immediately clear that the goal was no longer reform of the global liberal order, of the administrative state, and the Anglo-American financial empire, but that the goal was their obliteration. Early orders would begin targeting USAID, with one of the opening moves of the administration being to end the funding for the NGO nexus, through which these factions operated and exerted influence. And the pressure looked immediately to be getting to them. If they could no longer operate through state funding, they would be forced to put up their own wealth, play with their own assets at risk. He would place many figures into his cabinet, of whom it was immediately evident that the regime factions of the order were frightened. Robert Kennedy Jr. for Health and Human Services posed an immediate threat to the pharmaceutical, food, and insurance nexus that had come to become a behemoth within the American economy. Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence was the exact opposite of everything the intelligence agencies had become over the prior decades. Compartmentalized, secretive, and all too eager to act against the American public themselves. Yet one who made it through with very little visible opposition would be one of the most significant. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had learned the financial system working with Stan Druckenmiller and at George Soros's firm. He would then go on to start his own hedge fund, Key Square, where he became particularly expert in currencies. It seemed that Donald Trump had picked one of America's greatest currency experts in a financial war where the dollar was at the center. When making the announcement of his pick of Bessent, President Trump would go out of his way to note that Bessent's family came from old-stock American French Huguenots, something that takes on significant weight when he is going to have to go up against globalist, internationalist financiers. There would be a great deal of opposition to his cabinet, yet something emerged quite evident quite early on, that his political capital vastly outweighed that of the old liberal regimes, and he got his picks. There was a very clear common thread to the entirety of his cabinet picks. All, in their own respective domains, were the precise figure that you would pick if you wanted to unwind the apparatus that had ruled the United States since the end of the Second World War. And so, with the opening shots fired and the battle lines drawn, two powerful factions were now fully at war. There's a long history of gold in the economies of the world, and though it had been phased out of the global order's economy and largely left forgotten by investors, it still asserts itself occasionally, and particularly when there is geopolitical risk. Since December of 2024, gold prices had been rising sharply. Central banks around the world were buying it, and the world was coming to realize that with heightened conflict in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, with the risks inherent in the dollar, and with the great possibility that the Trump administration would rework the global financial system, that it was coming time to own real hard physical collateral once more. The London Bullion Market Association, the LBMA, is an association of miners, financiers, traders, brokers, and bankers, and the banks of the LBMA hold a great deal of the world's gold supply. Beginning in February of 2025, as the market for gold was getting bid up, the owners of futures contracts, who had historically almost always taken their gains on gold futures in the form of a cash settlement, began demanding physical delivery of their gold. They weren't making bets on gold, they were buying it. The LBMA promised a T+2 settlement, meaning that 2 days after the contract settled, the gold would be delivered. Yet as demand ramped up drastically, it became clear that the LBMA did not have the gold. Market participants began reporting T+60, T+90 settlements. The LBMA would say that they had the gold, but don't worry, we'll get it to you in 3 months. And thus it was immediately evident that they did not have the gold, and they were trying desperately to source it. Much conjecture has been made as to who was buying the gold in such enormous quantity. Central banks around the world have been pointed to. However, it looks as though the United States may have been one such large buyer, and one with the sheer political force to ensure the LBMA would make delivery. The LBMA was getting squeezed. The paper market for gold funds and gold futures, had become staggeringly larger than the actual supply of gold in the world's economy. And now the bankers of London were having to reckon with the fact that they had made promises that they could not fulfill. This was draining power from London. Their sway over the gold market had been for a long time a source of power, but now gold was leaving London, and they were being exposed as weak, all while the price difference between the spot market and the futures market for gold diverged more and more. The City of London bankers were looking very weak, all while the Americans were showing more and more interest in gold, in shoring up their balance sheet, and refusing to allow London to dictate their finances to them. If the world was re-collateralizing and placing its reserves in physical assets like gold, then it was breaking away from London's system, and it was showing that London had no ability to support itself in this new financial world. Domestically, President Donald Trump would begin mass layoffs, attempting to shrink the size of the administrative state. All the while, organized opposition would fight him at every turn in the courts. He would begin sweeping efforts to shut down America's borders and to deport illegal immigrants. This too would be fought at every turn in the courts, while the lower court judges began to assert to themselves the power of universal injunction, ruling on one particular localized case and applying it to jurisdictions outside of the scope of their court. Yet the Trump administration showed curiously little resistance. They were calm, slow, and simply worked through the system. However, over time it would be shown why, as the Supreme Court would begin a string of rulings in their favor, instantiating in America's highest court the Article II powers of the President, and squishing down the powers claimed by the legislatively created lower court judges. It came to look as though the administration was winning the legal fight. Yet the fight was fierce. The raw scale of the entrenched powers, particularly those who depended on the scope of the vast administrative state, on mass illegal migration, and on constant funding from the American government, were not willing to go down quietly and accept defeat, and so the government was at a state of civil war. Many of the detractors of the Trump administration would claim simply that he was trying to assert more power for himself. Yet this is a very small and superficial partisan read, as this fight was much greater in scope. The administration was attempting to fight out who had which powers in the American government, and in the American system as a whole. He was attempting to rein in the power of the lower court judges, who had increasingly asserted themselves as almost executives themselves, and to destroy the vast administrative apparatus, which was one of the main mechanisms by which the ruling factions of the old regime had dominated the country and the world. This wasn't merely a prosecution for his own power. This was a fight over who ran the country. The stakes in the battle for power and for the future of the global order were as high as they possibly could be. In March, the administration would continue to ramp up its deportation efforts, facing stiff opposition from organized counter-efforts, yet broadly general support from the population. And though this was a stiff fight, it was broadly in line with what people had expected. Yet during this time, a series of announcements would come that would prove to be a major shock. Vast sweeping tariffs were announced. Liberation Day. As the sheer scale of the tariffs caused panic across markets, financial media aligned with the Eurodollar banks and the imperial bankers of the old European empires began ramping up aggressive propaganda, claiming that the tariffs would cause an enormous economy-shattering depression, staggering inflation, and even going so far as to make claims that the US Treasury bond was doomed and that investors were flocking to the German Bund, an absolutely ludicrous claim, as the German Bund was an absolute wreck by comparison. So why would tariffs be such an intense point of contention? Well, in the Triffin Dilemma world, the entire Eurodollar financial system depended on a constant outflow of dollars. The trade system that had been instantiated following the Second World War ensured that there was a durable trade deficit between the United States and Europe, ensured that the European nations would be able to protect themselves with tariffs while the Americans would constantly supply them with more and more dollars. The entire survival of their system depended on the Triffin Dilemma remaining a dilemma. Yet, if trade agreements were being rewritten so as to ensure that the US dollar would not constantly be in a state of flowing out from the American economy and filling up the coffers of the rehypothecation engines of Europe, then this posed a grave risk to the systems of Europe and to the banking families who had run it for centuries. All the while, the US dollar was weakening, giving the Trump administration a sizable advantage in trade negotiations. The panic would be immense, and the propaganda perhaps even greater. More fights would begin in the courts, claiming that the president didn't have the power he was asserting to make such changes to trade policy. Yet, slow and steady, trade negotiations would make their way through. And already squeezed down by high US dollar rates, the end of LIBOR, a falling US dollar, and the tariffs that already were in place, the heavily strained Europe would find that it had no choice. The Europeans would cave. Ever since the end of the Second World War and the Marshall Plan, the American economy has been geared to ensure that it constantly liquefies Europe. For nearly 80 years, the United States economy has been set up and run to ensure that the ailing welfare states of Europe and the banking families who run it are constantly supplied with US dollars and purchasing power, all while the living standards of Americans is eroded away. After so long of this system, it became evident to those who understood it that it must end before Americans end up with nothing. And the durable trade advantage, the constant outflow of dollars, was one of the most substantial mechanisms upon which this system runs. So of course, this would be a dire fight for survival. Boxed deep into a corner, the Europeans found that they only had one option left. Only one more option to save their ailing economies. One more option as their political system declines into a state of illegitimacy and mass dissatisfaction, and while their financial system deteriorates worse and worse. Without the ability to feed off of the US dollar, their last move is capital controls. By May, after the initial tariff panic had worn off, markets began to ease back to normal. People came to realize that the worst-case scenarios that they had imagined were not coming to fruition. And while the situation was quite dire for Europe, in the United States, things seemed to generally be fairly normal. The tariffs, however, were only part of a much larger economic plan, particularly driven by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. The entire ordering of the United States economy was coming into question, with so many people left behind, so many people dissatisfied, and so many people who had been leeched off for decades. Not all Americans could agree on what they wanted the economy to look like, but everybody knew, not this. With both tariffs and the changes in the financial system working to lessen the constant outflow of US dollars, an idea was being raised more and more. What if the United States were to begin a sovereign wealth fund? The true assets of the United States are utterly gargantuan, and for all the talk of debt to GDP, if one were to look at the United States as though looking at a company's balance sheet, America's debts would look quite small compared to the sheer overwhelming enormity of its assets. So, perhaps the United States could fund itself and maintain its financial position utilizing its assets. One major problem with America's assets was that for a long time their economic value had been eroded down and down, not because of any true impairment, but because of the scale of the regulatory environment, which had created such a morass that even extremely valuable and productive assets were functionally useless. What's the point in an enormous deposit of natural resources if it would take many years and great fortunes just to make it through a handful of bureaucrats, only to spend the following years with an entirely different handful of bureaucrats? So, to the administration, deregulation became a priority. This, of course, was met by heavy resistance, not only from the financial ruling class of the order, who preferred for those assets to be down at zero, but from the sheer mass of bureaucrats themselves, who had been giving themselves paper-pushing jobs for their entire lives. What was this vast apparatus to do if their services were no longer required? Many new efforts began, efforts to increase domestic production, efforts to utilize the assets of the United States, and efforts to deregulate the economy. Many decades ago, the United States had made an enormous financial leap that had greatly improved the quality of life of its citizens and unlocked enormous potential. The 30-year mortgage was an innovation that allowed Americans to afford homes, to fund them, to have steady and reliable payments to meet, and to take their freed-up capital and start businesses. The disproportionate entrepreneurship in the United States, at least in part, owes itself to the mortgage system. Yet after 2008, home ownership had become more and more difficult. Vast swaths of America's younger generations felt that home ownership was a complete impossibility. If America wanted to leave behind the perpetual debt and tax system, the system where Americans own nothing, rent, work for large corporations, and pay cuts to foreign bankers who drain the system and take their assets, then it was going to be very important to rework America's housing, to get people into homes and get mortgage lenders lending again. To this end, the administration began looking at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, with an eye to release them from conservatorship and put them back out into the public market. The administration also began looking at various schemes, with various proposals floated like offering Americans HELOCs, so long as they remained at their home for a certain period of time, and there was reinvestment in United States Treasury bonds. The debt load was an issue, yet the new administration was looking at novel solutions, attempting to utilize the assets of the United States, acquiring equity positions, and tapping into the housing assets of Americans. Another issue to this end was how badly degraded small and regional banks had become across the United States, with lending now being done via boilerplate methods of forms and spreadsheets that had become very restrictive, and particularly with many self-employed and gig-working Americans. Many found it quite difficult to get loans. When cryptocurrency and stablecoin legislation would pass through the legislature, it would be set up such that small and regional banks would be able to make use of stablecoins. And when it comes to cryptocurrencies and stablecoins, there's a bit of a double-edged sword. Yes, there are certainly avenues for abuses, yet also it was reasoned that this would allow more people to access the US dollar, and therefore to get more buyers for US treasuries. It could also be an avenue to restart lending for small and regional banks, and at least for the administration, they seemed quite interested in getting small banking going again. The entire economic and financial system was changing, and changing in enormous ways. Indeed, it seemed itself like the Federal Reserve may be going through changes. The Treasury began examining the possibility of the direct issuance and marketing of Treasury securities through new digital assets, something which would, in effect, bypass the Fed. Though largely aligned on larger macro goals, the White House would spar with Fed Chair Jerome Powell. Certainly on the one hand, there was a desire for lower rates to spur the economy, though to a large extent, it looked like the White House was using Powell as a scapegoat, and not a true enemy, making a pitch to Americans as to why the Federal Reserve needed to be reformed, as this entire financial order was being changed, and changed away from the multi-century-old perpetual debt system, where the central bank gins up money and taxes feed it, all while the system takes on more and more debt, while the true assets disappear. Then the Fed's role, as it had been instantiated during the Roosevelt administration, would as well need to change. The Banking Acts of 1933 and 1935 had taken the decentralized Federal Reserve network from being the lender of last resort that backstopped the commercial paper market and turned it into the permanent monetizer of Treasury debt, with the Treasury hinting at bypassing the Fed with massive changes to Fed policy and the new ethos under Jerome Powell, and the constant war that had been waged against this financial order. Then the administration needed to make a pitch to the American people why this Fed model had to go. The entire notion of how this system funded itself was changing. Only months into the new administration, and the financial war had already begun to see enormous sweeping changes. The forces that the administration and the counter-elite factions were facing were old and deeply entrenched. While at its apex the system worked to benefit the old banking families of Europe, this system that had been built by these financial empires had many pieces. Two very powerful ones were the NGOs and the intelligence apparatuses. And while the administration had already moved forcefully against the NGO and state funding apparatus, that banking web that existed around the world had many other funding sources and many other assets, many of them which worked through criminal organizations. The powerful intelligence agencies had for a very long time worked as part of a nexus of banks and criminal organizations. There is an enormous amount of illegal capital that flows around the world all of the time. Where does it go? All of that money that comes from criminal organizations working with the CIA or MI6, where does it go? It exists in these offshore banking hubs. And if he wanted to go after the order, then he would have to destroy that funding mechanism. In June, federal law enforcement would raid a money laundering operation in California. What would follow would be the largest amassing of protests and riots that this administration had yet faced. Cutting off funding via USAID, the administrative state and the NGOs had resulted in a legal counterattack, yet going after the criminal offshore networks would get a physical one. Riots erupted across the country, and particularly in Los Angeles. It is no great secret that for some time, American intelligence had been working quite closely with organized crime in Mexico and South America. And while the administration was certainly going after organized crime in and of itself, and the cartels of Mexico particularly, this vast money laundering network, the offshore banking havens, and its intelligence facilitators were an enormous and crucial part of the power factions that he was now at war with. In August, he would get a serious trade negotiation surrender from the European Union, who agreed to pretty much whatever he wanted. These factions were boxed into a corner and were running out of options. Yet now conflict was physical and in the United States. America appeared to be on the brink, so perhaps this war would be kinetic. This nexus of power that had dominated the global order very desperately needed war. They needed to reset their system. They needed to make sure that the United States did not break away. They knew that financial crisis was coming. They could see it all unraveling, and war has always been their best way out. In June, American talks with Iran over their nuclear program seemed not to be going anywhere. Vast swaths of the American state and American legislature had been itching for regime change in Iran for some time. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom had been attempting to stir up conflict in the region. The Trump administration found itself in a difficult spot. It couldn't move too overtly against the neocons in the legislature, or else he risked having the legislature move against him. Yet he had made his goals clear, that he no longer wanted the United States to be weighed down in Middle Eastern wars, and he wanted the region to take care of itself. Further compounding the issue is that he needed to maintain the support of Zionists. Israel and Iran began to exchange missile fire, and with Israeli factions, the neocons, the State Department, and British influence all agitating for war, he didn't have many options. With enough time in retrospect, it appears as though he communicated directly with the Iranians to plan a strike on one of their nuclear facilities. This was a very risky move, but the effect it seemed to have was to call the bluff of both the Israelis and the Iranians. He was then also able to turn around to the neocons domestically, who had been using Iran's nuclear program as a pretense for a regime change, and say, "I struck the target. They no longer have a nuclear program. So what is it you want? You want an invasion?" This was able to take the agitation off the table for now, but it was clear that the old powers were very interested in getting a conflict started in the region once again. Yet this wasn't the only theater of concern. The much larger conflict that had been playing out since 2022 was Russia and Ukraine's war. This was the one that, above everything else, Europe needed, and many powerful elements within the American government, the State Department, and intelligence were very keen on seeing the United States dragged in further. Donald Trump and administration officials would begin meeting with the Russians, something which the Biden administration and the leaders of Europe more broadly had been extremely reluctant to do. While it isn't known exactly what has been going on during these talks, there seems to be some sort of understanding that has been emerging, some sort of understanding of who the factions are that want war, and that both Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump don't want their countries at war with each other. The administration would attempt many peace efforts, yet these were unsatisfactory to the Russians as they had the advantage in the war. Meanwhile, Zelensky, partially because of European backing, and also risks to him personally should the war end, as well stymied many of these efforts. Yet, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin continued to meet. It became clear that America and Russia did not want this war, and Europe did. Europe needs this war. Europe needs to default, re-collateralize, and save their failing system. Europe needs some way to bring this to an end so that they can retain their power, some way to revive their system, and additionally, some way to bog down the sovereigntists who threaten their order. A major diplomatic leap would occur in August, when Vladimir Putin would travel to Alaska to meet with the Trump administration and Donald Trump personally. There's great symbolism in this, due to Alaska originally being given to the United States by the Russians. And while Putin is unable to go anywhere in the European Union or United Kingdom, it's quite notable that he can go to Alaska. This is a very clear difference. If you were to travel to somewhere like London or Paris, most likely they would try to imprison him, yet he can go to Alaska. The United States does not want this war in the same way that Europe does. And now, as the two leaders continue to meet, the question remains, will they be able to find a solution, or will they get dragged into a war of mass slaughter by the Europeans? Almost immediately, as Labour took Parliament, their popularity began to plummet. The perceived legitimacy of Prime Minister Keir Starmer had reached such a low level, a level to which no living Briton had ever seen a Prime Minister before. For a long time now, the United Kingdom was the world's wealthiest city, surrounded by a poor country. Yet now, it was a wealthy postal code, surrounded by an utterly chaotic city, surrounded by a country even poorer than before. Britons had no future, and now Britons really didn't even have a country. And all of the benefits of the welfare state that had been promised to them following the end of the Second World War, well, they looked to be fantasies. Each morning, people would all scramble onto the phone lines at 8 a.m. to attempt to get a doctor's appointment through the NHS, only for most to find that they were either unable to get it or they would have to wait an extraordinary amount of time. Everything was falling apart. Crime was increasing substantially. The government was dysfunctional. The ruling classes showed clear contempt for normal people. Everything was grimy, people were poor, they had no houses, and people couldn't recognize their cities at all. The sheer level of discontent that the sustained policy of mass migration had caused in the United Kingdom had reached a point where the United Kingdom was functionally a failed state. A wave of English patriotism would arise, and Englishmen all across the country would begin putting St. George's crosses all across the surfaces of the nation. Increasingly, the right-wing and not left voices were coming to dominate the cultural discussion. And all the while, Westminster feared for their finances. They were struggling as is to maintain the pension system, the pensions that had been promised to the boomers. Yet for every young Briton, they knew that that pension would not be waiting for them. The United Kingdom simply could not sustain itself. And as more and more migrants, particularly from Africa, the Middle East, and Pakistan, would arrive in Great Britain. The English people had reached a breaking point. This became clearly evident to the ruling class. Following sexual assaults on a child committed by a migrant outside of a migrant hotel in Epping, large protests would emerge. The local council would vote to remove the migrant hotel, yet Britain's vast legal apparatus would squish this down, telling the town that they had no say in the matter, arguing that the preservation of the status quo was more important. Several major events had seemed to cause massive cultural shockwaves in Great Britain. The discovery of the grooming gangs, which had been kept hidden by the government. The Southport murders of young English girls by Axel Rudakabana. And now these assaults in Epping. Each time one of these would emerge, it would just push Britons a little bit further and further to the edge. The government could see this plainly, and with one of the worst approval ratings across all of Europe, this was making Downing Street nervous. And so they would begin flying flags of their own, the Union Jack mostly, still unable to bring themselves to wave English St. George's flags, something which they thought was for the backwards gamins. Of course, they did not accept the increasingly dominant position of the English, but they at least had to pander to it and pretend that they cared. And increasingly, as this dissident position would become dominant in the United Kingdom, a battle began to emerge between Nigel Farage, Rupert Lowe, and Robert Jenrick, each trying to outflank each other to prove their bona fides to become the voice for Britons, and perhaps the next Prime Minister. Certainly in polling, it came to look quite evident that if an election were held that day, Nigel Farage would become Prime Minister. And though he drew great ire and distrust from the British right, his positions had become dragged along with the changing discourse, increasingly promising more and more anti-migration measures, and embracing the position of re-migration. In September, Britons would come from all over Great Britain and converge in London for an enormous protest, spearheaded by Tommy Robinson. The protest had one point to make: send them home. Establishment media would immediately object to these protests, simultaneously showing themselves to be afraid of this force, and also trying to downplay it. Initial reports would make claims of, there were only 70,000, perhaps 100,000, only for later reporting to say, 150,000, 200,000. And while truthfully, we don't know how many people attended, aerial footage indicates that it could be as high as 1 million or greater. It was an enormous outpouring, and one that Britain's ruling establishment could not ignore. All the while, the United States hammered them on trade. Their welfare state fell apart. Perception of government legitimacy eroded, and perhaps most alarming of all for London, they were losing the dollar. Already badly damaged by the instantiation of SOFR, rising American interest rates, and the Trump administration's efforts to cleave the dollar from the eurodollar. Since the beginning of the administration, sovereign debt spreads between the US Treasury and the British gilt exploded. Now this spread is very important, as the eurodollar rehypothecation engine requires US treasuries as an underlying asset to run on, while the British state requires the gilt to finance itself. So for London, it is very important to keep those spreads tight, so that the city can rehypothecate using US treasuries, and the government can finance their debt at rates that they can handle. Yet now, spreads were reaching levels that had only last been seen during the chaotic end of Liz Truss's premiership. There are very few options left for the British ruling classes. For the old banking families, they are quite evidently trying to move their wealth to the offshore havens and to Dubai. For the bureaucrats of Whitehall, they have to stare down the rising tide of English resentment. For Keir Starmer, he has to hope that he doesn't get kicked out via a leadership challenge. London doesn't have many options for how to keep its machine going. It can hope to somehow claw its way back into the United States, perhaps through the soft power means it has always utilized, like sowing discontent, or it can foment a foreign war. And for the broader liberal establishment, it's very clear that it cannot handle the raw force that is coming at it from anti-migration sentiment. So perhaps it will make a desperate attempt at remigration, hoping to ingratiate itself back into the good graces of Britons. Or perhaps it will try something more sinister and underhanded, fomenting discontent and making the population fight amongst itself, preserving itself in the process, while the country falls to chaos. That's certainly much more in line with the behavior that has come out of GCHQ in the City of London historically. Yet it seems that Reform UK may be their last attempt at trying to parlay with the British people and offer them something that they will accept. Either way, their system is ending, and there's no way that they can financially sustain themselves. So the question in the United Kingdom is, how bad is it going to be? There are a few paths forward in the United Kingdom at this point. One, where it stabilizes somewhat. It becomes a relatively middle-income country, loses many of its welfare state elements, and ethnically balkanizes. Another option is that somebody like Nigel Farage, or more substantially, Rupert Lowe, becomes Prime Minister, and remigration policies begin. The question here, of course, is how much chaos would be associated with this? And even in that scenario, the country is so badly degraded that the quality of life for Britons will still be rather bleak, yet they will have stability. Yet another possibility, and one that looks increasingly probable, is that it will simply devolve into ethnic conflict, that the regions of Great Britain will balkanize and become functionally separate nations. Certainly there are powers at the top of the global order who are seeking chaos, who are seeking conflict, and who do want young men radicalized and angry. Those at the top of the British Empire have utilized this method several times over their long history, as such men are the best candidates to drag into a war. Additionally, as the financial factions of the City of London abscond with their wealth, it would be quite nice to not have anyone try to stop them. There's a difficult needle that must be threaded by the Britons. Their system is most certainly coming to an end, and they have to deal with a situation that could very easily devolve into violent chaos, yet figure out how to manage it with calm and rational minds. And particularly with all the mounting financial problems in the United Kingdom, the worsening economic state of Britons, the erosion of their welfare state, and the ever-increasing hopelessness, it's a very dangerous set of characteristics that do not bode well for a peaceful society. Britain isn't alone. And really, if we think back all these centuries, if we think back to that thing that crawled into London all those lifetimes ago, it's hard to call it British. That thing came from the continent. The powerful factions that based their wealth on banking. The powerful factions of old families. The ones who dominated the empires of Europe for centuries. They were in the Dutch Empire, the French, in the banking havens of Luxembourg and Switzerland. Long, long ago, we found them in Venice. They're still there. They're there around Brussels, Berlin and Frankfurt, and all across Western Europe. Across the European Union, these same problems are present. The end of this order isn't a problem for countries. It's a problem for one vast empire, one big network of bankers, their politicians and intelligence apparatuses, their NGOs and their media. It's a problem for the Anglo-American Empire and their liberal world order project. And in the European Union, it's particularly dire. It seems that every country in Western Europe is facing similar problems. Their systems can just no longer keep going. France has always been a home for wild revolts and civil war, and its long history of chaos has certainly not ended now. Emmanuel Macron has increasingly asserted to himself more and more power, all while the strength and legitimacy of the government falls apart. He has been increasingly attempting to bring more and more of the government's power under his own office. Yet every time he makes a move to solidify his power, he loses the perception of legitimacy and resentment grows. Marine Le Pen of the dissident National Rally had been barred by the judiciary from seeking to become France's president. Largely to the French people, the legal system looked farcical. It's become increasingly evident in France that this is a government desperately trying to hold on, and violent chaos grows. Though not in the same dire state as the United Kingdom, their conflict for migration has become quite severe as well. Their finances are abysmal. They've taken on an enormous amount of debt, and they can't fund their welfare state either. All while those banking families of Paris, who in some cases are the same families as those in London, are attempting to move their wealth out. They're stuck in the same situation, trying to find a way to credibly default and restart their system, trying to find a way to keep it going. And with the avenue of fomenting chaos to derail dissidents, France is perhaps the most ideal candidate in all of Europe. The Germans face much the same problems. Germany was once renowned as an industrial powerhouse, famous for the remarkable quality of their goods. Yet currently, their GDP per capita places them between the 49th and 50th state of the United States. With a little under $56,000 per capita, they slightly outperform the state of Mississippi, yet underperform Arkansas. They've destroyed much of their energy production, and the costs they now face are astronomical. After the Second World War, Germany was put in a box. They were satiated, given a welfare state to limp along with, and made docile and immobile so that they would never form any sort of political movement again. They can no longer afford this system, not while they're competing with Mississippi for productive output, and with far higher energy costs. Their government is losing legitimacy, and it looks increasingly like the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, is coming to win with more and more of the German public. And while they hold many positions, there's really one at the core of their movement: get the migrants out. This is the issue for Europe. While it's certainly an issue in the United States, Americans don't understand the level to which mass migration in Europe has led to extreme discontent and conflict. And at the time of recording, German local elections are imminent, and a notable EU bureaucrat has already made the statement that if the election results are unsatisfactory, then the EU will simply have it annulled. While this may seem like a wild assertion, the EU has already done this in Romania. In 2025, after Romanians elected Calin Georgescu, the EU would claim that the Russians had run an influence campaign, and therefore the results were invalid, and Georgescu cannot win and may not run. They provided no evidence of this assertion, except finding an entire double-digit number of social media accounts, which they claim came from Russia. And it's curious why they use such a pathetically flimsy excuse. Perhaps it was flexing power, or perhaps it was simply desperation acting desperate. Yet either way, the EU simply said, "No, you chose wrong." And why? Why did the EU fear this outcome? Was Georgescu really this wild radical like they claimed? No, it's because they feared that Romania would go against their wishes with respect to the Russo-Ukrainian war. In fact, when Hungary would vote against increased aid for Ukraine during a vote of EU member states, the EU's response would be to simply strip Hungary of its voting rights. That way they could hold the vote again, and have everyone who votes correctly have their say. The EU is showing clear signs of staggering desperation. They're increasingly flexing more and more power that they don't have the political capital to match. The UK has been arresting thousands of people each year for social media posts which are critical of the Westminster regime. They've created a vast censorship apparatus, and they've aggressively clamped down on communications and the internet. The EU is following suit. In the United Kingdom and in Europe, the leaders know that they cannot win with the public, and that they have lost the cultural argument. And thus, they have decided to silence discontent. The EU has rolled out its own censorship apparatus, its internet controls, and its colloquially termed Ministry of Truth. They assert to themselves the power to cancel elections should they go against the ruling powers. And while their financial problems close in on them, they've increasingly been building and ramping up capital controls. For the past few years, the EU and the ECB have been giving updates on the digital euro, while the United Kingdom has announced a mandatory digital ID, as well as their own digital pound. The German Bund was once considered Europe's safe haven asset, yet similar to the British gilt, it has been performing worse and worse since the start of the Trump administration. In the beginning of 2025, financial media would point out capital flowing into Germany and a rise in their stock market, saying that this was a great thing for Germany and that people believed in Germany once more. But money was flowing in to settle debts and to close positions, and that rise in the stock market came as people were selling German bunds. People may look at the German Bund and see its low yield, thinking therefore investors have confidence in it. But it only maintains that low yield because the German state forces so many institutions to own it. It's an artificial rate, and even then, it's been losing out against the US Treasury as the spread collapses. And not only has this movement in spreads occurred between the German Bund and the US Treasury, but Spain and Italy are now outperforming. In fact, watching capital flows, it looks as though money is flowing out of Germany and toward the Mediterranean. It's worth noting that Italy is much more friendly to the Trump administration and the new economic order. Germany's main dissident party, the AfD, is rising. France's unrest is increasing, and Emmanuel Macron's position is looking shakier. As of September 2025, enormous protests and riots have erupted outside The Hague in the Netherlands. The bonds of the EU are underperforming, and capital, social, and informational controls are going up, all while their leaders gleefully push for war in Ukraine. Europe is standing on a precipice, and it's very difficult to imagine any future in Europe that doesn't involve chaos, collapse, poverty, and death. With so much of the order's financial power, economic power, military and intelligence apparatus held in the United States, this fight over the end of this era, the end of this system, has the United States right at the center of the game board. While the financial order is being reshaped, the role of the dollar changed, and American sovereigntist bankers are asserting themselves over the city of London, a war takes place in the markets. While the administrative state battles for control over the vast bureaucracy of the United States, over whether power is held in the hands of the Article 2 executive or in the administrators, a war takes place in the bureaucracy. While the economy is reshaped, while small businesses, housing, and mortgages are all realigned, while insurance and pharmaceutical companies are challenged for their years of abuse, while domestic production is prioritized, the Triffin Dilemma is unwound, and the constant outflow of dollars slowed, there is a trade war all around the world. While the power and role of the intelligence apparatus is fought, the system of money laundering and offshore bank havens, the system of regime change and propaganda, agitation and political machinations, the system of clandestine politics, blackmail, and assassinations is fought in the shadows, there is a clandestine war. While the NGOs are wrung out, while the arteries that connect organized crime, bankers, the administrative state, intelligence, and lawyers that carries out all of the regime's dirty work are stripped of their funding and forced out into the open, there is a legal war. While the power of judges is confronted, the role of the lower courts, the arbiters, and the American legal system is challenged before the highest court in the nation. There is a judicial war. On every front, the American system is changing. This is a process that nearly every human will live through in his or her life. And that's simply because no system lasts forever. A process began in 2008, A process when the liquidity machine was turned on full, and the order just waited for the next crisis. A process began at the end of the Second World War, as the Marshall Plan decided that the United States would fund Europe. A process began in 1688, when Dutch financiers backed William of Orange, and the Dutch perpetual debt system made its way into London, and made its bankers lords. In many ways, the major dissident figures of today, while they have major will and are shaping history, they're just the ones who stepped up. They're the ones who said something, for the system was going to come to an end. And now the question is, how does it do so? And after that, what comes next? The political climate in the United States has been tense for years. The sheer panic and paranoia has reached such a level that whole swaths of the population are convinced that the end of civilization is upon them, and they're witnessing some great atrocity. Of course, there are propagandists of the order's regime, and the social media algorithms that fuel rage. But more than that, there's just a deep discomfort. Particularly amongst young people, there's an intuitive understanding that this system will not provide for them, and that there's no future in it. And that's not wrong, for this system is coming to an end. The coastal liberals of the middle and upper classes are perhaps the ones most frightened. They see the populists and dissidents and blame them. If only they hadn't started complaining, then the old system would still remain. But they're just blaming a messenger. For while the system has been very good to them, too much of the population has been abused. Its financial machinery and its institutions are breaking down. But more than all of that, people just don't believe in it anymore. And it isn't because others told them not to, but because for most of the population, they simply found its promises weren't true. So the illusion of consensus politics has been shattered, and history resumes as it always has, with a fight for power. This conflict isn't going to be resolved with a calm discussion during a constitutional convention. Somebody is going to take power. And this greatly frightens that class. They believe that the rules govern society, yet those rules only mean something when a society exists to follow them. There must be underlying values and cohesion for them to function. And it wasn't the populists, nor dissidents, nor even the radicals who unwound that cohesion. That's simply what happens in a system when a system can no longer run. And maybe that's one of the hardest things to hear, that there's nothing that could have been done. It was always going to end. So what of the Trump administration and all those populist figures across the West? Well, they were the messengers, and now the ones taking out the elements of the old system before they metastasize, the ones setting things in motion. But they're not going to be the ones who build the next system. The administration is simply cleaving the US off from the old order as it dies. But what the next one is, that's yet to be decided. Years and years of abuse. Years and years of neglect and watching quality of life slip away, all while being sneered at by the upper classes of the coasts. That built a profound resentment amongst the lower classes of the United States. Young people doing everything right, following all the rules and doing what they were told would lead them to prosperity, only to find themselves in mountains of debt and with that future ripped away from them. They too have been filled with a deep resentment, and some have been radicalized to brutal extremes, some violent. And as belief in the old system evaporates, belief in its foundation myths, its assertions and right-to-rule story, all fade away into history. People have been left scrambling, trying to find some philosophical foundation to stand on. Populists have risen in opposition to the system, angry at all of those abuses. The right has spawned a plethora of new philosophical movements, some quite spiritual and responsible, rooting themselves deeply in Christianity, while others are more resentful and brutal. And as liberalism has reached its ultimate conclusion, it has splintered off in many directions. Once it looked as though critical theory and Marxist thought were gaining dominance all across the institutions of the West, yet now they find themselves on the back foot and losing the cultural argument. Many young people who thought that they were doing the right thing, who followed the establishment, followed it thinking it would lead to prosperity, Young people who did as they were told and followed it into the universities. Well, many of them have started to snap. For a long time, consensus politics has been an illusion. Yet in September, with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, many of those still holding on to it found the illusion shattered. Now everyone has to see it. Everyone has to look at it. This left at the end of liberalism is losing power culturally and doesn't have many moves left. And it has many young men who thought that they were doing the right thing, who thought that they were being good and followed the rules to nowhere. Young men who feel like they have nothing left but violence. Meanwhile, there is an agitation campaign attempting to stir up younger men, reactionary to the cultural leftism that had been forced on them their entire lives, hoping to turn these young men into a violent counter-reaction. This great banking empire, this order that has ruled the United States since the end of the Second World War, doesn't have many moves left. All it has left is conflict. The Marxist-aligned left are a depreciating asset to the powerful. There's not much left that they can do, yet they can be thrown at America to derail it, as it goes about dislodging this empire. And it can be used to solicit a counter-reaction from young men, one to derail and send them off to needless conflict. So now that's America's great fight. Will it be derailed by needless conflict? Because if passions and hatred lead it off too far, then this old imperial class will be able to take everything, abscond, and make the United States a nation of poor renters with nobody to protect what is theirs. Or that can be resisted. Europe is almost certainly heading into conflict, but the United States has a choice. The order is ending, but more than that, liberalism is ending. Because of the sheer leverage in the system, the sheer debt in the governments and the rehypothecation engines, because of the over-financialization and the death of its myths, because the legitimacy of its institutions, its right-to-rule story, and the trust of the people are dead. Because people don't believe anymore, and because the philosophy has hit its limit, it's ending. People have come to find the story of total equality, the blank slate, the universal human condition, and the irrelevance of cultures and peoples to be all untrue. It's the philosophy itself that can no longer be sustained. So more than just a new economic order, an entirely new philosophical order is what we must contend with. Because the opposition is too great, because the shared beliefs and values needed for cohesion and prosperity are gone, and because the system relied on that prosperity to justify itself, because new technology allows people to communicate and to see too much of how the system really works, because the Western militaries can no longer enforce their hegemony, because of crime and bureaucratic bloat, because of demographics and overburdened welfare states, because of dissatisfaction of the young, and because the progressive story requires constant momentum. We are on the verge of something very different. So, what are we going to do? Will we succumb to our passions, to utopian visions and ideological fervor? Will we succumb to blind rage and cruelty? This leftist movement at the end of liberalism has few options. They have nowhere to go from here. Yet just because they are flailing, that does not mean that the young men of the right should feel themselves to be secure and above it all. Its young men can as well be led around by their passions, to go too far, and to be led off to slaughter. That's the next great danger. So what are we going to do? Because if we are not careful, this faction, this system, these families in this way of thinking that crawled into London all those years ago and are now fighting for their survival, could very easily take everything and leave, leading our young men to their deaths and taking all of our wealth for themselves. Or we can build something. We can tell them no, and we can stay in this fight. And with a mind not toward hate nor wrath, but toward creation. Not toward that resentment that they have always led the world around by. Not toward greed, cruelty, nor lust, but toward actually building something with our eyes towards something greater. For as this system is attacked on all sides, by internal opposition and by rising nations standing as a counterforce, it will, as it always has, attempt to lead its young men off to war. to inflame passions, and to save themselves with the demise of others. Every empire ends, and now the question is, what are we going to do with it? Throughout this film, I've attempted to simply tell a story and leave my own opinions out of it. But if I can take one small indulgence, I suggest we build something great out of this empire of debt.